The midday sun beat down on the Arizona desert as Elena Vasquez's jeep sputtered to a halt on the narrow dirt road cutting through Marble Canyon. She was 3 miles from the nearest highway, documenting rock formations for her geology dissertation, when the engine gave its final gasp. The temperature gauge had been climbing for the last 10 minutes, but she'd ignored it, focused on reaching one more outcropping before heading back. Now the smell of burning oil filled the air, and no amount of turning the key would coax life back into the engine. No cell signal. She'd checked that obsessively since entering the canyon. No water beyond the half-empty bottle in her backpack, maybe 16 ounces at most. July temperatures would climb past 115 degrees within hours, and the forecast she'd checked that morning predicted a brutal heat wave settling over northern Arizona for the next week. The isolation was complete and terrifying. She hadn't passed another vehicle in over 2 hours, and her planned route through this remote section of the Navajo Nation wouldn't raise alarm bells for at least 3 days when she failed to check in with her advisor at Northern Arizona University. 3 days seemed like an eternity as she stared at the empty road stretching in both directions. She tried the ignition 4 more times, each attempt more desperate than the last, before accepting the grim reality of her situation. The canyon walls rose steep and unforgiving on both sides, red sandstone glowing like embers in the harsh afternoon light. Every surface radiated heat back at her, creating a convection oven effect that made breathing feel like inhaling fire. Elena grabbed her backpack, notepad, and the emergency kit from the trunk. A flashlight with batteries she hoped still worked, waterproof matches, a thin emergency blanket that seemed laughably inadequate now, and a small first aid kit containing band-aids and aspirin that would be useless against what she faced. Her field research equipment, including her expensive camera and GPS unit, were useless without the Jeep's charging system. The GPS had died first, its last reading showing her position as coordinates that no one would think to search for days, possibly weeks, if search teams focused on more commonly traveled routes. She thought about her sister in Tucson, about her grandfather's stories of desert survival, about all the things she'd taken for granted, water fountains, air conditioning, ice cubes tinkling in glasses. Those comforts belonged to a different world now. Before we continue with Elena's incredible story of survival, I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Your support means everything. And now, let's get back to how Elena fought to stay alive in one of America's most unforgiving landscapes. The canyon offered no shade at ground level, just endless exposure to the punishing sun. Elena's training as a geologist kicked in as she studied the rock walls with new urgency, searching for any natural shelter, any geological feature that might provide protection. About 40 yards ahead, she spotted a narrow fissure where 2 rock faces met at an angle, creating a small alcove carved out by millions of years of wind and water erosion. It wasn't much, barely a dimple in the massive canyon wall, but it represented the difference between immediate death and a chance to survive. She stumbled toward it, already feeling the beginning stages of heat exhaustion, dizziness that made the ground tilt, rapid heartbeat hammering against her ribs, the metallic taste of fear coating her tongue and throat. Her shirt was already soaked with sweat, dark patches spreading across the light blue fabric, and she knew that every drop of moisture leaving her body was bringing her closer to a critical threshold where her organs would begin shutting down. Sweat meant survival in the short term, but death in the long term without water to replace what was lost. The human body was roughly 60% water, and she was literally evaporating. The alcove was barely 5 feet deep and 3 feet wide, a cramped space that would become her entire world for the next month. The rock felt blessedly cool against her palms as she pressed herself into the deepest recess, the temperature at least 10 degrees lower than the exposed canyon floor. Elena forced herself to think systematically, pushing down panic and forcing her mind into the logical patterns that had made her a successful graduate student. She drew on every survival lesson she'd absorbed during her years studying in harsh field conditions, summers in Death Valley, winters in the Colorado Rockies, always prepared, always careful, except for today. She rationed 3 small sips from her water bottle, holding each in her mouth for several seconds to maximize absorption through her oral membranes before swallowing. She had maybe 12 ounces left, possibly less. At this temperature, with her body already dehydrated from hours in the sun, she would die in 3 days, maybe 4, if she was incredibly disciplined and lucky enough to find supplementary water sources. That was the brutal mathematics of desert survival. 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, 3 minutes without air. She had no food, but that didn't matter yet. Water was everything. As the afternoon sun shifted across the canyon in its relentless arc, Elena noticed something crucial that would shape her survival strategy. The alcove's shade would only last until about 2 o'clock, maybe 2:30 at the latest. After that, the sun's angle would change and direct sunlight would pour into her shelter, turning it from refuge into oven, baking her against the stone that was now her only protection. The temperature inside the alcove would easily exceed 130 degrees once the sun hit it directly, hot enough to cause fatal hypothermia within hours, cooking her brain and organs like meat on a grill. She'd read accounts of hikers found dead in the desert with core body temperatures over 110 degrees, their proteins literally denaturing from the heat. She needed to think like the desert creatures that survived here, despite conditions that seemed incompatible with life. Kangaroo rats that never drank a drop of water in their entire lives, extracting moisture from seeds through metabolic processes. Roadrunners that sought shade during peak heat and became active only at dawn and dusk. Rattlesnakes that spent 95% of their time underground or in rock crevices. Find shade, create shade, adapt or die. Those were her only options in this hostile landscape that killed the unprepared with ruthless efficiency. That's when she remembered the loose stones scattered throughout the canyon floor like a giant's abandoned toy blocks. Sedimentary rock, fractured by thousands of years of temperature extremes and water erosion, lying everywhere in pieces, ranging from fist-sized to boulder-sized chunks that had carved off from the main canyon walls. If she could stack enough stones strategically, she might extend the alcove's shade through the worst heat of the day, creating an artificial shadow that moved with the sun. It was engineering meets desperation, geology applied to survival, but it gave her something concrete to focus on, besides the growing panic clawing at her chest, like a living thing trying to escape. Her grandfather had always said idle hands and idle minds led to death in the desert. Keep moving, keep thinking, keep fighting until you couldn't anymore. Elena forced herself to move during the remaining shaded hours, knowing that working in direct sun would accelerate her dehydration catastrophically, potentially adding hours to her timeline toward death. Each stone she carried felt like lifting concrete blocks as her body struggled with the heat and declining energy reserves, muscles protesting, lungs burning. But she worked methodically, scientifically, applying her geological knowledge to the problem. Flat pieces for the base, creating a stable foundation that wouldn't collapse and crush her. Smaller rocks wedged between them for stability, using the same principles ancient peoples had used to build structures that lasted millennia without mortar or modern tools. She arranged them in a curved pattern that would cast the maximum shadow as the sun traveled its predictable arc across the sky, mentally calculating angles and shadow lengths based on the date and her approximate latitude. By sunset on the first day, she'd built a crude barrier about 3 feet high and 6 feet long that would cast precious additional shade, maybe buying her another 2 or 3 hours of survivable temperatures each afternoon. Her hands were scraped raw, fingernails broken and bleeding, her muscles screaming in protest, but she had created something tangible between herself and death. She had built hope out of rocks and desperation. The desert night brought different dangers that Elena hadn't fully anticipated when she'd driven into the canyon that morning. Temperatures plummeted from 115 degrees to the low 50s within hours, a 70-degree swing that shocked her body into violent shivering. She wrapped the emergency blanket around her shoulders, the thin metallic material crackling with every movement. It helped somewhat, reflecting her body heat back at her, but it wasn't designed for warmth in the traditional sense, just for preventing heat loss in emergency situations, and this qualified. She heard coyotes yipping in the distance, their calls echoing off the canyon walls in an eerie chorus that made her skin crawl. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, distorted by the acoustic properties of the rock formations. The rustle of creatures she couldn't identify made every nerve fire with adrenaline. Her body flooded with stress hormones that kept her awake, despite her exhaustion. She imagined rattlesnakes seeking the warmth of her body heat, attracted to the thermal signature of a large mammal, scorpions crawling across her legs with their venomous stingers raised, all the dangerous desert inhabitants that became active after dark when temperatures became survivable for cold-blooded creatures. Every sound made her flinch, every shadow seemed threatening in the dim starlight. She allowed herself 2 more small sips of water at midnight, checking her phone's clock even though the device had no signal and only 15% battery remaining. She knew she was already falling dangerously behind on hydration, her body's water debt growing with every hour. Her lips were cracking, bleeding slightly at the corners where they split with each grimace. Her mouth felt dry as the sand beneath her, her tongue beginning to swell and stick to her palate, making it difficult to swallow the precious water she allowed herself. But panic wouldn't help. Only systematic thinking and rigid conservation would give her a chance to survive until someone realized she was missing and organized a search party. Her advisor expected her check-in call on Thursday evening. Today was Monday afternoon. 3 days minimum before anyone would worry. And Professor Williams wasn't the worrying type. He'd probably assume she'd extended her research and forgotten to call, maybe even wait until Friday before expressing concern. Another day or 2 minimum before they'd pinpoint her research area from her filed field plan and send help. 5 days, maybe 6 or 7 before anyone came looking, in conditions that killed experienced hikers in 36 hours. The math was brutally simple and utterly terrifying. Dawn on the second day brought renewed determination, mixed with the grim realization of just how dire her situation had become. Elena examined her stone wall with a surveyor's critical eye, seeing both its strengths and fatal weaknesses in the growing light. The structure had worked reasonably well yesterday afternoon, providing maybe 2 extra hours of shade, but it needed improvement, optimization, expansion. She spent the cool morning hours, from first light at 5:30 until the temperature climbed past 90 around 8 o'clock, improving it systematically. She added height and width, testing different configurations by observing how shadows fell at different times, making mental calculations about the sun's path through the sky at this latitude in July. She discovered that certain flat rocks, when angled properly at about 45 degrees and positioned precisely, created small pockets of shade that she could retreat into as the sun moved across the sky, like a sundial in reverse, where the shadow became the useful part. She was essentially building a survival puzzle, using her geological knowledge to battle the immutable physics of solar radiation and heat transfer, fighting nature with applied science and desperate ingenuity. The jeep sat uselessly in the distance, about 60 yards away, its metallic surface already radiating heat like a furnace by 9 in the morning. Elena made the dangerous journey to it during the coolest part of the morning, conserving her energy by moving slowly and deliberately. She stripped the rubber floor mats from the driver and passenger sides, heavy-duty all-weather mats that her father had insisted she buy for fieldwork. She unscrewed the rearview mirror with shaking hands, using a dime from her pocket as a makeshift screwdriver, working slowly and carefully despite her urgency because dropping the mirror would shatter her only signaling device. She also took the car registration from the glove box, thinking maybe she could write a message on the back if she needed to, though she had no idea who would find it or when. The Jeep's interior was already uninhabitable, the steering wheel too hot to touch, the dashboard probably exceeding 150 degrees in the confined space. She grabbed the vinyl cover from the spare tire in the back, thinking it might provide additional shade material and a bungee cord that might help secure things. Back at her alcove, gasping from the exertion and heat, Elena used rocks to prop the floor mats at angles near her shelter, creating additional shade panels that added precious degrees of cooling to her microenvironment. She experimented with different positions, observing how the shadows fell, making minute adjustments that might mean the difference between survivable and lethal temperatures. The mirror became her signaling device, positioned where it might catch the attention of any aircraft overhead, angled toward the most likely flight path based on her knowledge of the area's air traffic patterns. She knew the chances were slim in this remote area. Most flights were commercial jets at 30,000 feet, far too high to notice a mirror flash. But it gave her something to hope for, something active to do besides waiting to die. She wedged her backpack into gaps between stones, using every available material as insulation or shade. The structure was ugly and precarious, definitely not something she'd ever photograph for aesthetic purposes, but it worked functionally. She had created a micro-environment that stayed several degrees cooler than the surrounding canyon, potentially the difference between life and death in the coming days. Water became her singular obsession, consuming every thought with increasing intensity. Elena's bottle was completely empty by mid-afternoon on day 3, and she felt her body beginning the systematic shutdown process. Her tongue swelled against her teeth, making it difficult and painful to swallow even her own saliva, which had become thick and ropey. Her thoughts grew foggy and disconnected, jumping randomly between topics like a radio stuck between stations. Dark spots danced at the edges of her vision like black butterflies, her peripheral vision compromised by declining blood pressure and oxygen delivery to her optic nerves. Her urine had turned dark amber, then brown, then stopped completely, a dire sign that her kidneys were struggling and approaching failure. The human body would sacrifice the kidneys to preserve heart and brain function, shutting down non-essential systems to conserve the remaining water in her blood. She knew the medical progression because she'd taken wilderness medicine courses as part of her field training. Soon, her blood would thicken, her heart would struggle to pump it, her brain would begin suffering from lack of perfusion. Death would come from multiple organ failure within another day, 2 at most. That night, desperate and delirious, she scraped condensation from the emergency blanket where her breath had moistened it throughout the day, using the edge of her notebook to collect tiny droplets into the medicine bottle. She got perhaps a teaspoon of water, barely enough to wet her cracked lips, but it was something tangible. It was proof that water could be extracted from this hostile environment if she was smart enough and desperate enough and lucky enough. The condensation gave her an idea that would ultimately save her life, a solution born from desperation, scientific knowledge, and the willingness to try anything no matter how unlikely. She remembered her grandfather's stories about survival in the Sonoran Desert, tales from his youth working as a guide in the harshest parts of Mexico and southern Arizona in the 1950s and 60s. He'd told her how indigenous peoples had thrived for thousands of years in conditions that would kill unprepared outsiders within days, living successfully in places where modern people couldn't imagine surviving. They knew which plants held moisture in their roots and stems, barrel cactus that could provide emergency water, mesquite pods that contained nutrition and some moisture, prickly pear that held water in its pads. They knew where water collected in natural rock tanks called tinajas after rare rains, sometimes holding water for months in the shade of overhangs. They knew how to read the landscape for signs of underground seeps, following vegetation patterns and animal trails to hidden water sources. Elena studied every crack and crevice in the canyon walls with new intensity, searching for any sign of water seepage, any darker stain that might indicate moisture, any place where ancient water had left its mineral signature in the rock. She looked for the telltale green of plant life, for any change in rock color or texture that might indicate water, for anything that broke the pattern of dry stone. On the morning of day 4, delirious and desperate, moving on pure instinct and fading hope, she found it. A small depression in the canyon wall about 50 yards from her shelter. A natural bowl carved into the sandstone where water had obviously pooled during the spring snowmelt months earlier. The rock was still slightly darker than the surrounding stone, indicating residual moisture, and slightly cooler to the touch when she pressed her palm against it, the porous sandstone acting like a sponge that slowly released moisture. Elena had learned in her sedimentology courses that sandstone could hold water in its pores like a reservoir, sometimes for months after surface water disappeared. This depression had probably held a pool of water 6 inches deep during April and May, slowly evaporating but leaving moisture trapped in the rock matrix below the surface. She pressed her emergency blanket into the depression at sunrise, weighting the edges with carefully selected stones to create a sealed collection point, a closed system where evaporated moisture would have nowhere to go except condense on the plastic and drip downward. It was a desperate gamble based on half-remembered survival guides she'd read years ago and the basic physics of evaporation and condensation, but it was her only option besides lying down and waiting to die. She had to try something, had to take action, had to fight. The theory was elegantly simple in concept, though uncertain in execution. As the day heated up, any remaining moisture trapped in the porous rock would evaporate upward, driven by heat and the concentration gradient between the wet rock and dry air. The plastic blanket would trap that moisture, preventing it from escaping into the atmosphere. As the plastic cooled slightly compared to the surrounding air, especially around the edges where it touched the cooler rock, water vapor would condense on its surface and drip down to the lowest point. Just like moisture condensing on a cold glass on a hot day, Elena used an empty medicine bottle from her first aid kit as the collection vessel, positioning it carefully beneath the lowest point of the blanket, where she'd created a small depression with her finger. She checked it obsessively throughout the day, crawling to the site every hour despite her weakness, watching for any sign that her theory was working, that she hadn't just wasted precious energy and her only waterproof material on a fool's errand that would hasten her death. By evening on day 4, after what felt like an eternity of watching and waiting and praying, she had perhaps 2 ounces of murky water collected in the bottle. It was brown with dissolved minerals, tasted like plastic and rock and chemicals, but it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever experienced in her life. She drank half immediately, feeling the moisture coat her swollen tongue and cracked throat, bringing momentary relief that was almost painful in its intensity. She saved the other half for the morning, knowing from her wilderness medicine training that drinking too much at once could cause problems with her electrolyte balance, and then carefully reset the solar still for the next day, positioning everything precisely. It wasn't enough water to truly hydrate her failing body, nowhere near the gallons she needed to restore normal function, but it was enough to keep the immediate threat of death at bay for another day. It was enough to give her hope, and hope was its own form of nourishment, feeding her determination to survive one more sunrise. Days 5 through 10 blurred together in a haze of heat, thirst, and grim determination that bordered on obsession. Elena's body adapted in small ways that surprised and fascinated the scientist in her, even as the human in her struggled to maintain consciousness. She learned to breathe through her nose exclusively to conserve moisture, keeping her mouth closed despite the difficulty, because breathing through the mouth caused water vapor to escape with every exhalation. She learned to move only during the precious hours of dawn and dusk, when temperatures dropped below lethal levels from 5:30 to 8 in the morning and 6:30 to 9 in the evening. She learned to position herself precisely in the shadow zones her stone structure created as they shifted throughout the day, moving like a lizard from one pocket of shade to another, always staying in the coolest available spot. She marked time by scratching lines into a flat rock with a sharper stone, needing to maintain some connection to linear time as her mind grew increasingly foggy and disconnected. Each morning she reset her solar still, and each evening she collected her meager 2 or 3 ounces of water, occasionally getting as much as 4 ounces if the humidity was slightly higher or if she'd positioned the collection system particularly well. Her body consumed its own muscle tissue for energy in the absence of food, breaking down protein to fuel essential functions. Her clothes hung loose on a frame that grew gaunter each day, her ribs becoming visible, her face drawn and skeletal. She could feel her body cannibalizing itself, muscles weakening, organs struggling, systems shutting down one by one. Her period stopped immediately, her body recognizing the crisis and shutting down non-essential reproductive functions. Her hair began falling out in small clumps, protein being diverted from growing hair to maintaining vital organs. Her skin became paper-thin and fragile, tearing easily on the rough rocks, healing slowly or not at all because her body lacked the resources for repair. She developed sores where her body pressed against the stone, pressure ulcers that would have been trivial under normal circumstances but became serious wounds when her immune system was compromised. The physical deterioration was relentless and terrifying to observe in herself. By day 7, Elena could barely walk the 50 yards to her solar still without resting twice, leaning against the canyon wall and gasping, her heart pounding irregularly. Her legs trembled with weakness, muscles wasting away, no longer reliable for supporting her weight. Her vision blurred and doubled, her eyes drying out and struggling to focus, her brain receiving inconsistent signals from dying optic nerves. Her heart raced arrhythmically from electrolyte depletion, beating too fast, then too slow, skipping beats and fluttering in her chest like a trapped bird. She knew she was approaching the absolute limit of human survival without adequate water and nutrition. People had died with more resources, in less hostile conditions, with better initial health. But something stubborn in her core refused to surrender to the statistical probability of death. Maybe it was her grandfather's blood, his survival instincts passed down through generations. Maybe it was the scientist in her, fascinated even now by her body's adaptations and determined to observe and record even her own death if it came to that. Maybe it was simple animal instinct, the mammalian brainstem refusing to lie down and let the desert claim another victim. She began talking to herself on day 9, holding entire conversations with her grandfather, her advisor, her younger sister back in Tucson. The line between delirium and consciousness grew thin and wavering, reality blending with hallucination in ways that were sometimes comforting and sometimes terrifying. She knew these conversations weren't real, that her mind was breaking down from dehydration and isolation and sensory deprivation, but they provided comfort during the endless hot hours when she lay in her alcove, trying not to move, trying not to breathe too hard, trying not to use energy she didn't have. Her grandfather told her to keep moving, to stay in the shade, to trust her intelligence and training. Her sister sang childhood songs in Spanish that their mother had taught them, songs that made Eleanor cry precious tears she couldn't afford to lose. Her advisor reminded her of her research, the importance of systematic observation even in crisis, treating her survival as another field problem to be solved through scientific method. The stone structure had become her entire world, her universe reduced to this small alcove and the rock wall she'd built. Each rock was familiar and named in her deteriorating mind. Big Flat for the large slab that formed the foundation, Little Shadow for the perfectly angled piece that cast shade during the hottest part of the day, Lucky for the rock that had perfect dimensions for filling a crucial gap. She knew which one caught the first light of dawn, announcing a new day survived, which stayed coolest longest as the afternoon wore on, which one she could lean against when the weakness became overwhelming and she needed support to stay upright. She had arranged and rearranged them countless times, optimizing the shade pattern through trial and error, creating small niches for different times of day, building a three-dimensional puzzle that maximized her survival chances. It was architecture born of desperation, engineering driven by the will to survive one more sunrise, geology applied to the ultimate practical problem. On day 12, Elena heard the distant sound of an engine and thought it was another hallucination. She'd heard engines before in her delirium, phantom sounds that her damaged brain constructed from the wind and her own pulse pounding in her ears. She'd seen rescue helicopters that vanished like mirages when she tried to focus on them, cars that drove past without stopping because they didn't exist outside her mind. But this sound grew louder, more persistent, maintaining consistency across several minutes instead of fading away. It had a real quality that the hallucinations lacked, a mechanical rhythm that her brain couldn't quite replicate. She crawled from her alcove into the punishing midday sun, ignoring the immediate shock of heat that felt like being struck by a physical force, grabbing the rearview mirror with trembling hands that could barely grip the glass. The reflection of sunlight off the mirror was weak and wavering, her hands shaking too badly for sustained signaling, but she tried desperately. Over and over she tried, flashing the mirror toward the sound, toward where she thought the sound was coming from, praying it was real and not another cruel trick her dying brain was playing, praying someone would see the flash of light and investigate. The ATV appeared around a bend in the canyon, and Elena thought her mind had finally broken completely beyond repair. But the vehicle stopped, engine idling, dust settling around its tires. A man dismounted, wearing the dark green uniform of a Navajo Nation ranger, his face registering shock as he saw her skeletal form lying in the sun holding a mirror. His expression went from surprise to horror to professional calm within seconds. He reached for his radio immediately, calling for medical evacuation, his voice urgent but controlled as he reported finding a critically ill woman in Marble Canyon. Coordinates provided, immediate airlift required. Elena tried to speak, but only a croak emerged from her ruined throat, her vocal cords damaged and her mouth too dry to form words. She tried to smile, to show gratitude, but her face wouldn't cooperate, muscles no longer responding to commands from her brain. The ranger, whose name was James Bennerly, gently moved her back into the shade of her stone structure while they waited for the helicopter he'd called for. He marveled at what she'd built, walking around the perimeter slowly, understanding immediately what the stones meant for her survival. He recognized it as a traditional desert survival technique, something his grandfather had taught him from Navajo. Survival wisdom passed down through countless generations. He gave her small sips of water from his canteen, knowing instinctively that too much too fast could be dangerous when someone was this severely dehydrated, potentially causing electrolyte imbalances that could trigger heart problems or seizures. He wet a cloth and dabbed her face, cleaning away dirt and dried blood and making her slightly more comfortable. He told her she was safe now, that help was coming, that she'd done an incredible job surviving, that she should be proud of what she'd accomplished. James later said that she'd been reported missing 4 days earlier on day 27 of her ordeal. that search teams had been combing the area systematically, working from most likely to least likely locations based on her filed research plans, that she'd been extraordinarily lucky he'd chosen this particular canyon for his patrol route that day. He normally patrolled this area only once or twice a month, and he'd almost skipped it today to focus on areas where hikers were more commonly reported missing. Some instinct, some feeling he couldn't explain, had made him decide to check the remote canyons first. He'd found her jeep abandoned and followed the faint traces of her movement to this alcove, following logic about where a geologist in trouble might seek shelter. The medical helicopter arrived within 40 minutes, the longest 40 minutes of Elena's life as she teetered between consciousness and collapse. James holding her hand and talking to keep her engaged, asking her about her research, her university, anything to keep her mind active. The paramedics assessed her quickly with practiced efficiency: severe dehydration, malnutrition, exposure damage, kidney function critically compromised, but alive. Against all odds and medical statistics and survival data, she was somehow alive. They started an IV immediately, fluids flowing into her collapsed veins as they loaded her onto the stretcher with practiced gentleness, stabilizing her neck and spine as a precaution. James Benally rode with her to the helicopter, still holding her hand, telling her she was safe now, she'd made it, she'd survived something most people wouldn't have. He stayed with her until they loaded her onto the helicopter, and she saw tears in his eyes as they lifted off, this strong ranger crying for a stranger he'd saved. At the hospital in Flagstaff, doctors were astounded by her condition and the fact of her survival. 31 days in the desert with minimal water should have been fatal, was fatal in almost every recorded case they could find in medical literature. The solar still had provided just enough moisture to keep her kidneys functioning at minimal capacity, barely enough to prevent complete renal failure. The stone structure had prevented fatal hypothermia by maintaining a survivable microclimate, keeping her body temperature below the lethal threshold of 108 to 110 degrees. Her geological knowledge had literally saved her life, turning academic theory into practical survival engineering, applying classroom learning to the ultimate field test. One doctor told her, once she was stable enough to understand, that most people wouldn't have lasted a week in those conditions, that her systematic approach and refusal to panic had made the impossible barely possible, that she'd threaded a needle of survival that was impossibly narrow. Recovery was long and painful and frustrating. Elena spent 2 weeks in the intensive care unit receiving IV fluids continuously, nutrients through a feeding tube because her digestive system had shut down, and treatment for kidney damage that would require months of monitoring. Her kidneys eventually recovered most function but would never be quite normal again, leaving her with a permanent reminder of those 31 days. She received treatment for severe exposure injuries, her skin damaged by UV radiation despite her shade efforts, requiring skin grafts on her hands and face. Her body had been depleted to dangerous levels that would take months to rebuild. Muscle mass gone, bone density decreased, organ function compromised. But she was alive. And as her strength gradually returned and her mind cleared from the fog of dehydration and trauma, so did her wonder at what she'd accomplished. The stone structure, her makeshift solar still, the rigid discipline of rationing and shade-seeking, the systematic problem-solving approach, it had all worked together just well enough to keep her alive. No single element would have been sufficient, but the combination of techniques, applied consistently across 31 days, had created a survival margin measured in ounces of water and degrees of temperature. She'd been lucky too, she knew that. Lucky in the weather patterns that had brought slightly higher humidity during week 2. Lucky in James Benally's decision to patrol that particular canyon on day 31. Lucky that her body had held together just long enough. 3 months later, After extensive physical therapy and psychological counseling to process the trauma, Elena returned to Marble Canyon with James Benally and a news crew documenting survival stories for a documentary about extreme endurance. The network had heard about her case and wanted to tell her story, to examine the site where she'd survived, to understand the techniques that had saved her life. Her stone structure was still there, weathered but intact, a monument to human determination and ingenuity that would probably stand for years in this remote location. She stood in the alcove that had been her home for 31 days, running her hands over rocks she'd positioned with shaking, desperate hands, feeling the cool stone against her palms, and felt overwhelming gratitude wash over her in waves that made her knees weak. Gratitude for her grandfather's stories that had taught her to respect and understand the desert, for her scientific training that had given her the knowledge to engineer a survival solution, for James Benally's instinct that had brought him to this canyon on that particular day, for every small decision and moment of discipline that had kept her alive one more day. James told her that desert survival stories were common in his culture, woven through Navajo history and legend, that the land tested everyone who entered it without proper respect and preparation, that she'd passed a test most people never faced and few survived. He showed her other survival sites scattered throughout the canyon system where ancient peoples had built similar structures, rock alignments that captured shade and channeled rare rainwater, pottery shards near places where water could be collected, proof that humans had been solving these same problems for thousands of years. Elena understood then that she'd tapped into something primal and ancient, a knowledge written into human DNA about how to survive when everything else was stripped away, when all the comforts of modern life disappeared and only the fundamental challenges remained. Her dissertation research took on new meaning and purpose after the ordeal. Elena wrote extensively about survival architecture, about how understanding geology could mean the difference between life and death in extreme environments, about the relationship between landscape knowledge and human resilience. Her thesis, initially planned as a dry academic study of sedimentary patterns, became something more meaningful, an exploration of how geological knowledge could be applied to practical survival situations. She gave talks at universities across the Southwest about her experience, teaching geology students that their knowledge wasn't just academic curiosity or career preparation. It was potentially life-saving, practical in ways they'd never considered. She trained with search and rescue teams throughout Arizona and New Mexico, sharing techniques for desert survival, emphasizing the importance of shade creation, water collection, systematic thinking under pressure, and never giving up even when death seemed inevitable. The experience changed her fundamentally in ways she was still discovering. Elena developed a deep respect for the desert that went beyond scientific appreciation or academic interest. She understood its power intimately now, having felt it trying to kill her for 31 days, and its lessons about what really mattered when survival was uncertain. How it stripped away everything unnecessary and revealed the core of what made someone want to live, what made them fight hour after hour when logic said fighting was pointless. Survival, she realized, was about more than physical techniques and knowledge, though those were critical. It was about mental discipline, about systematic thinking under pressure when panic was easy and logic was hard, about the refusal to surrender when surrender seemed not just logical but inevitable. It was about finding reasons to survive one more hour, then another, until enough hours accumulated into days and days into weeks. Her stone structure became something of a landmark in the canyon system. Rangers began including it in their regular patrols, checking it periodically to ensure it remained stable, using it as a teaching example for survival training sessions they conducted for hikers and researchers working in the area. Some administrative officials suggested removing it, arguing it was technically an unauthorized structure in a protected area, but James Benally argued successfully for its preservation as a testament to human resilience and an educational resource. It stood now as a reminder that knowledge, determination, systematic problem-solving, and refusal to accept death could overcome even the harshest conditions nature offered. School groups sometimes visited it on field trips, learning about geology and survival, seeing physical proof that intelligence and discipline could triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances. Elena's family threw a celebration when she finally returned home to Tucson, 5 months after her ordeal, still rebuilding her strength, but finally strong enough to travel and engage with normal life again. Her sister cried and held her for long minutes, unable to let go, terrified by how close she'd come to losing her only sibling. Her grandfather nodded with quiet pride, his weathered face showing deep emotion he rarely expressed, understanding what she'd endured in a way others couldn't because he'd faced similar tests in his youth. He told her she'd honored their family's survival legacy, that she'd proved the old ways of thinking about the land and its challenges still mattered in the modern world of GPS and cell phones and emergency beacons. Elena realized that her 31 days hadn't just been about surviving against physical odds. They'd been about connecting with something deeper, about understanding that humans were still capable of extraordinary adaptation when pushed to absolute limits, that the soft modern lifestyle hadn't completely erased the survival instincts that had kept the species alive for millennia. Her mother, who'd spent those 5 months swinging between hope and despair, between anger at her daughter's risk-taking and gratitude for her survival, couldn't stop touching her, as if verifying her physical reality. Friends came from across the state, colleagues from the university, professors who'd taught her, field researchers who'd worked with her. They all wanted to hear the story, to understand how she'd survived, to learn what lessons applied to their own fieldwork. Elena found herself telling it repeatedly, the narrative becoming smoother and more coherent, with each retelling processing the trauma through storytelling in a way that therapy alone couldn't achieve. The media attention was overwhelming and sometimes unwelcome. Elena gave interviews to newspapers, appeared on morning news shows, participated in survival podcasts, always emphasizing the geological knowledge and systematic thinking that had saved her rather than portraying herself as some kind of superhero. She wanted people to understand that survival was accessible, that knowledge could be learned, that anyone could develop the mental discipline required if they committed to training and preparation. She didn't want her story to become entertainment, divorced from its practical lessons about respecting nature and understanding the environments we entered. Several universities offered her speaking positions, wanting her to share her experience with students studying geology, outdoor recreation, and emergency management. Elena accepted selectively, choosing programs that would genuinely benefit from her experience rather than those seeking celebrity association. She developed a presentation about geological survival that she gave to students heading into field research positions, covering not just her specific techniques, but the broader principles of systematic thinking, resource conservation, and mental resilience. Many students told her afterward that her presentation had fundamentally changed how they approached fieldwork, making them more cautious, better prepared, more respectful of nature's power. Today, 5 years after those 31 days in Marble Canyon, Elena continues her geological research with a different perspective and a deeper purpose. She carries better emergency equipment now, redundant systems for communication and navigation, always assuming something will fail, because she knows from brutal experience that it will. She maintains more rigorous check-in protocols, updating people on her location twice daily, providing detailed itineraries that would allow rescuers to find her quickly if she went missing. She never underestimates the desert's power or assumes she can't become a victim again, because she knows that confidence killed more people than the desert itself ever did. But she also carries something more valuable than equipment: the confidence of someone who faced death systematically and methodically and won through knowledge and discipline, who discovered strength she didn't know she possessed, who learned that the human will to survive was stronger than she'd imagined. The scars on her hands remind her daily of those stones, each one carefully selected and positioned, each one representing another hour of survival, another small victory against impossible odds in the unforgiving landscape where 31 days became a lifetime of lessons learned. She traces them sometimes while thinking, feeling the ridge of tissue where deep cuts had healed imperfectly, remembering the sharp edges of sandstone, the weight of rocks carried on trembling arms, the desperate construction of a wall between herself and death. Those scars tell a story her words sometimes can't capture, a physical record of determination and desperation and survival written permanently into her flesh. Elena married James Benally 3 years after he saved her life, their relationship growing from gratitude and respect into genuine love as they worked together on desert safety initiatives and search and rescue operations. He understood her in ways others couldn't, having seen her at her absolute worst and recognizing the strength that had kept her alive. They had a daughter they named Hope, a name that seemed perfect given their story, and Eleanor sometimes holds her daughter and thinks about how close she came to never experiencing this joy, never knowing this small person who depended on her. The stone structure in Marble Canyon stands as an unofficial monument not just to survival, but to the life that came after, to hope, and to hope itself. She visits the site once a year, on the anniversary of her rescue, always with James, sometimes with other family members or colleagues who want to see where it happened. She touches the stones, adds a small rock to the structure to maintain it, and spends a few minutes in silence, remembering those 31 days and honoring the person she was, who refused to die there. The alcove is her cathedral, the stone wall her altar, the desert her teacher, who gave her the hardest lesson anyone could learn and let her survive to tell about it. She leaves water bottles sometimes, cached in a waterproof container hidden in the rocks, just in case someone else someday finds themselves where she was, fighting for life in a hostile landscape with nothing but determination and ingenuity between them and death.